sciences. We've seen probes that go to Mars, Jupiter, Pluto even, a lot of planetary, and they are precursors in my way of thinking, they are the precursors to human space flight. And then in Earth orbit, we just do a lot of scientific research, a lot of things weightless. I'll give you an example. One is pharmaceuticals, which they have found that in zero G, you can separate basic stuff with in a way you can't do it on Earth. So there's a lot of research just trying to be in space. And then there's a big elephant in the room that the Department of Defense, and this is true both in our country and in America and also in the UK. Many satellites that gather intelligence, most of it is obviously very secret. You don't hear much about it. It's very encrypted data, and all the countries around the world do it. Defense communications are entirely different than the commercial communications. You can't get on them. And they're used in the battlefield. They're used in other places. Navigation, the GPS that drives your cell phone location, was actually put into orbit, still is maintained by the military. It's a constellation of satellites. And then, for instance, when in Afghanistan or in the Middle East, we fly drones, but we fly those from the United States. And so we don't have pilots in them, and they do a lot of intelligence gathering, but they could also deliver weapons. And final thing, and this is the last we're going to talk about robotic space, the Department of Defense budget in the US by far overshadows everything else we do. It's called the black budget. You never hear about it. You don't know how big it is, but it's huge and a very big operation. And so I bring this up because all of these things are a piece of robotic technology, and it's getting better and better, and it's going more toward AI, artificial intelligence. And so it's something that there's all kinds of fields for people to go to work in this remote robotic area. So I just wanted you to know that. So our primary focus today is on human spaceflight. And I'm going to give you a quick history and pictures. Let's look at what happened from 1945, the end of World War II, where we had some fighters. I should have put a Spitfire there instead of a P-51, but we'll let it go. And we had the V-2 rocket that rained some terror on London. In a relatively short time later, we started Program Mercury, which was a one-man capsule right at the very top of this Atlas rocket. And this is an Atlas that launched John Glenn into orbit. And then in 1968, just 6 years after we started with Mercury, we created Apollo and got it to the moon, first time in 1968. So it was quite an advancement, and it happened fairly fast. There were three guys that really kind of made it happen. These were all rocket guys, a Russian, an American, and a German. Notice that their birthdays overlapped, and these three guys actually talked. Well, they corresponded with each other, and on rocketry, and they kept saying, "Yeah, you might do this, we might could do that, we might could do this," back and forth. And so they developed, and Robert Goddard over here in this country actually launched the first American liquid rocket. It wasn't much bigger than a tube of paste, but it worked, And so anyway, these three guys were really the fathers of rocketry as we know it. Now, it started clear back with the Chinese, but these guys perfected it. The Germans picked up on it first, and in World War II, in this base way up here, way north in Germany, called Peenemünde, is where they developed two vehicles that anybody with a London background knows a lot about their families anyway. First was the V1. V was Vengeance. Vengeance 1, the buzz bomb. And they launched those from mobile launchers off the French in the area of Calais and rained them down with great terror on London. A lot of destruction, a lot of death. But it wasn't even a rocket, it was a pulse jet. That thing on the tail, sitting on top, is a pulse jet engine. Actually burned gasoline, just like you do in your car. And it was pulsed a jet, and that's why it made the buzzing sound. But they did build the V2, Vengeance 2, and it was a two-stage liquid-propelled rocket. And had they gotten this developed earlier, the World War II may have had a different outcome because it came in right at the end of the war. And again, the V2 biggest impact was in London, did a lot of damage. And that was, the Peenemünde operation was run by a guy named Werner von Braun. Von Braun, at the time this picture was taken at Peenemünde, was 29 years old. He was kind of a genius at rocketry. And when the war ended, the Russians tried to get most of the guys, and we tried to get most of the guys. And it turns out we ended up with von Braun, and we were very, very fortunate because he's the one that got us the Saturn rocket that got us onto the moon. You'll see the American GI in the far left of the picture with his helmet on. This was the day that he had actually gotten himself turned in to the Americans. And he had been in a car wreck and he broke his arm. I got to know von Braun, and a very interesting guy. Well, the Russians picked up, though, and they took their technology even faster than we did, and they launched the Soviet Sputnik. This was about a 23-inch round satellite, weighed about 200 pounds. All it did was go in Earth orbit and beep, 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 but it threw the terror in the rest of, particularly the Western world, that the Russians had gotten ahead, the Soviets, in this case, it was the Soviet Union, and we were aghast. We answered in America with the Jupiter in '58. If I go back, this was October of '57, and so just a few minutes later, or a few months later, we launched the Jupiter, or the Explorer on the Jupiter, and as a Jupiter rocket. This was a payload up in the front end that was scientific, and it actually discovered the Van Allen radiation belt, and so it was a good deal. But April of '61, the Russians, or the Soviet Union, I should say, beat us again. Yuri Gagarin, astronaut, went into orbit, launched on a Vostok K, which looks very much like the Soyuz rocket of today. It hasn't changed much. And at that point, something happened. This was only a month later. We had not even put anyone into orbit yet, that JFK, John F. Kennedy, our president, set the goal to go to the moon in this decade of the '60s, and landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. And there was the goal. It was 240,000 miles away, 3,500 kilometers in diameter, so about a third the size of the Earth. And that was our goal, and it was clearly set. Let's go do it. Things happened in a hurry after that. The Mercury project came along. That was one person. Gemini was the second project. That was two people. And that's a very important program before we got to Apollo. Now, I want to make a point here. We call these different projects themselves, Mercury and Gemini. They were really all part of Apollo, because this is how we learned to get into space. Gemini taught us how to rendezvous and dock and things like that. And then Apollo was the culmination. here was the sequence it went in. And notice I'm calling this Mercury Redstone on the left. There were only 2 missions flown of that. If you look at the very top, there is a capsule or a spacecraft carried 1 person. 2 of these missions at the first, we flew on a Redstone missile, which was an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, that had already been on the shelf, already designed. We modified it to put people in orbit. We only flew 2 of those, and it was not enough to get into orbit. We could get into space. So we just lobbed them down the Pacific Ocean about 300 miles, and they got a few minutes of 0G, but that was all. Mercury Atlas came along, and the Atlas was a much bigger vehicle. It was another intercontinental ballistic missile that was modified to put this same capsule, same spacecraft that we had in Mercury on top, but it could go all the way to orbit. And we flew that 4 times. John Glenn was the first American to go into orbit, and we flew it 3 more times. Longest mission was only 34 hours, not nearly long enough to get to the moon. Then we launched the Gemini spacecraft with 2 people that we launched on another intercontinental ballistic missile, the Titan, that was modified to carry humans. And by the way, those modifications of these early vehicles, it was to give them more redundancy, to be more safe. We flew 10 missions of those, and that's really where we learned how to rendezvous and dock, go outside, do an extravehicular activity, EVA we call it, spacewalk, some people, and do work outside. And Gemini is the one that taught us how to do that. And then there was Apollo. The Apollo Saturn, the Saturn V, was von Braun's game. And these are not drawn to scale. These are not drawn to scale. They look kind of like they're the same size. This one's 111 meters long. The Saturn is huge compared to 25 meters on the Redstone. Giant vehicle. For those of you that are familiar with American football, it's longer than a football field, 100 yards. It's 363 feet. So von Braun was the one that gave us the liquid. This is the first time that we used this big rocket. I'm going to show you how we did that in this kind of a sequence. We got off to a really bad start. On Apollo 1, we had 3 guys, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, that were doing a pad test. We were on the pad at Cape Canaveral. And we had a fire on the pad inside the cockpit, and it killed all 3 of them. They were good friends, well known to us in mission control, and it was a very dark day. We learned a lot from that accident, but we paid a terrible, terrible price for it. And I'll discuss some of those as we go forward, some of those corrections that we did. Interestingly enough, only 21 months later, with a completely redesigned command module, which is that on the right-hand picture is that little white cone right at the top, completely redesigned, all the flammable material in it removed, the hatch in the old one swung in, which made it hard to get out of it in a hurry. The one on the new one actually had an explosive bolt that would blow it open and open it quickly. And we changed from 100% oxygen, which we had done in Mercury and Gemini, and we went to more like an air mixture. So it wasn't quite so flammable. These guys flew a great mission. And notice this date, October 1968. And then I think in the boldest decision ever made by the space agency, in December, 2 months later, we put 3 astronauts, Borman, Anders, and Lovell, on top of a Saturn V, which we had flown it in some unmanned versions, but never with people. We not only put them in it, we sent them to the moon. We didn't have a lander, so we went into orbit around the moon with Apollo 8 at Christmas of 1968. For all intents and purposes, and we didn't know it at the time, the space race with the Soviets was over about that time, because at the same time, they had a great big explosion on their launch pad where they were building their big Saturn class rocket. And it not only wiped out the pad and the rocket, they had their control people very close, and it damaged that building and killed some of their key people on the ground. So Apollo 8 was a milestone, big one. And after that, we rode that Saturn hard. I've already spoken of these three missions: Apollo 1, the Fire, Apollo 7, Apollo 8, 7 in Earth orbit, 8 in lunar orbit, and then 9 is the first time we flew a lunar module, a lander, and we flew them in Earth orbit together. And they danced together, they docked, they undocked, etc. And then on Apollo 10, which was a dress rehearsal for the Apollo 11, the next flight, the first landing. This flight was not intended to land. It was taken into lunar orbit. It was docked up again. We did docking, started a landing and aborted it. That spacecraft, by the way, the lunar module could not have landed anyway. It was too heavy. There was a second block of spacecraft that came along, and that first one came on Apollo 11. Most of you have read a lot about and studied and so forth. Apollo 11, great day. A little more about that in a minute. 12 followed right on its heels. And it was a very successful mission. 13 didn't work so well. We had an oxygen tank exploded on the way to the moon, and it became a survival mission, which worked out well, as it turned out. A little on that later. 14, we did land. And then 15, 16, and 17, the last three missions, we call those the J missions. That was just a block of missions. This was the first time on Apollo 15 that we had a rover. So 15, 16, and 17 had the rover that actually went around the moon. And it gave us great more capability. These spacecraft, the lunar modules were designed such they could stay on the moon a little longer. So the stay time was longer. A lot of fun in those missions. I was on all of them. I was a flight director in mission control. A little more on that in a second. Landing sites. Here we go on the moon. Apollo 11 landed in the Sea of Tranquility, and those dark gray areas you see are more oceans and seas, thought to be at one time with water or some liquid on them, that over time flattened them and made them smoother. And then the cratered areas, the more cratered areas, they've got craters in the seas, but the big craters are in the highlands that are up higher, that you see in the light gray there. So we landed in the Sea of Tranquility. In that case, we told Neil Armstrong, just land anywhere where it's smooth. We don't care. It's not as important. 12, we actually landed in the ocean of storms, another ocean, more rugged than the Sea of Tranquility. And 12 landed in a place where the Surveyor spacecraft, a robotic spacecraft, had been sent up and landed on the moon a few years earlier. And we had to see if we could make a pinpoint landing, get close enough to it to go get parts off of that Surveyor. And they did. They cut pieces and wires and cameras and all kinds of things off and brought them back for study on how they had fared in the lunar atmosphere and the lunar conditions, extreme hot, extreme cold. 14 was even in a more rugged area, in an area called Fra Mauro, and was really a success, highly successful. Then those three missions that I pointed out at the end, the J missions, went way high, way up here on 15, to what they call the Highlands, and landed at a place called Hadley Rill, which was very, very rugged. It has a canyon in it bigger than our Grand Canyon, on Earth by a lot. And so geologists and lunar scientists like to see rough places so they can see the substrata. They don't like oceans where it's flat. They like it where it's rugged. 16, we went down here to an area called Descartes. And Descartes was very rugged. Another good sample of the moon and how it was made up. And then 17, we went high again up to a place called Torres Litro, probably the most rugged area we landed in. Had boulders as big as houses in it. So that's, people say, well, you covered the front face. We had no capability to land on the back side. Couldn't do it. And so what we did, if you put those landings on the Earth, and I've posted here on Europe, you'd run from United Kingdom up here in the Highlands to down here to Portugal and down to the Med and up to northern Germany. And that's about it. So it wasn't a huge area that we explored. If you laid that in the United States on the East Coast, those of you familiar with geography over here, we would have gotten out to about Arkansas from the East Coast, so not very far to the American West. The point is that we had 6 landings, but we didn't cover the moon by any stretch of the imagination. There's still a lot more about the moon we don't know as we do know. So finally, December 72, this is Gene Cernan, gave a final salute. That's the rover tire behind his backpack. I wish he'd gotten a little farther forward. We could have seen the lunar module flag and the rover, but you can see a little bit of a tire on the rover right behind him. One thing, notice how dirty he is. This is something we have to work on the next time we get back to the moon. The moon surface is covered with something they call the regolith. Forget that, it's dirt. It's very fine dirt, almost like graphite or pumice or something, very, very flour. And when you get it on a suit like this, they tried to brush it off and it would just push it into the fabric. So there's a lot of work being done on trying to clean that up when we go back to the moon. This is a favorite picture of mine. It was taken on Apollo 8 by a guy I flew with later in a fighter squadron, or before this, I flew with him in a fighter squadron, a guy named Bill Anders. And he took this picture the first time they saw the moon or the Earth rise as they came around the lunar surface at Christmas. And he said something afterwards that I always has stuck with me. He said, we came to explore the moon and discovered the Earth, which I think is kind of a neat. Every astronaut that went to the moon talked about how fragile this little blue ball looked. And they realized with their thumb, they could cover up everything they had ever known in their lives. All the people, all the countries, all the history, all of that, they could cover it up with their thumb. And they all commented on that. So I said, in many ways, Apollo, we went to explore it, but we really found the moon. Now I want to shift gears and talk about the people. Mission Ops. By the way, I've got a shirt on here that has the same patch on it. And those of us that were in mission control like to wear it when we can. So this was a good excuse. The Latin on the top is achievement through excellence. I hope I got that. It's what we keep saying, and I hope some of you are probably Latin students and are probably going to call me wrong. But anyway, that was our patch that we live by. Mission Control existed in this building. It was called Building 30 at the Johnson Space Center. It was my home for 9.5 years. And later, we named it, it was renamed the Christopher C. Kraft. Chris Kraft was, you're going to see a picture of him in a minute, but he was really the father of flight control. He started it in Mercury. He was my mentor. He was the guy that made me what I am. And I think I owe a great deal to him. He just died last year at the age of 95. still going strong. But so here's how I got started. I went to Texas A&M University. And the reason I went there is because I wanted to study to be an aeronautical engineer, and I wanted to fly. And at that time, A&M was a total military school. It had Corps cadets that I was in. I was an officer in the Corps my senior year. And my last year, my third year, fourth year, Lucia and I had a conversation. We call it the senior year, is your last year in college. But anyway, my older brother was 9.5 years older, had been a pilot in World War II, a B-17 pilot. He was 19 years old. And I thought he was bigger than anything. He was actually about 5'9", but I thought he was a giant. And I wanted to be like him. I wanted to do what he had done, go into the military and fly. And I thought maybe the way to do that is go to A&M, which was available, study aeronautical engineering, and get a commission. Well, I did. I got commissioned as a second lieutenant when I graduated in the Air Force. And I ended up in a fighter squadron flying in this F-101B Voodoo supersonic airplane. Carried 2 nuclear air-to-air missiles, 1.5 kilotons each, and 2 heat-seeking general explosive missiles. I was 23 years old. 23 years old, and I was, in charge of this complex airplane with weapons of destruction, which luckily never did have to fire in anger. As soon as I was in that fighter squadron when NASA was formed, and I decided that's where I really want to be. I want to go to mission control. It took me a little while to get there. I had more time in the Air Force. I had to serve. I served for a short time with Lockheed Martin in a robotic defense satellite, the early versions of spy satellites in California. I kept trying to get to NASA, and I finally made it. I was a flight controller in Gemini. I was a guidance, navigation, and control guy. And after the fire, Chris decided he needed 3 more flight directors, and he reached down and plucked me out of the crowd and said, "You're going to be a flight director for Apollo." I said, "Yes, sir." So I was. And after Apollo, I went to headquarters and did some other things, 2 other NASA centers. I came back to the Johnson Space Center to be the director of the center and have charge of all the whole thing. And at that time, we had just started flying the shuttle. So I got in on the shuttle business before I retired, but I can't claim a lot of credit for the development of it because I was off doing other things for NASA at that point at headquarters and 2 other centers. I took over at JSC at Johnson Space Center after the 5th mission of the shuttle. That was STS-5. And there I am with the mentor and his subject in 1982. He was retiring and I replaced him. I've always told him I never could replace you, I just succeeded you. And but anyway, he was a great, great friend. Control centers all looked alike in a way. This is the only one that was not in Houston. The one called Mercury was at Cape Canaveral. And we flew all of the Mercury flights from that Mercury Control Center at the Cape. And we flew the first 3 Gemini flights, which only one of them was manned from there. And then we shifted to Houston for Gemini and Apollo. You'll see on the right at the upper, and that's the room we flew all of the Gemini in and all of the Apollo in. We actually had 2 floors, but they were identical. And then the space shuttle on the lower left, you can see it looks very similar. They took the tiers. It was no longer tiered consoles. It was on a flat floor. And the International Space Station this picture on the lower right was taken not very long ago. And I don't know what the age is like in this. It's probably a little older. But let me tell you about the Gemini Control Center. And I'm going to tell you, kind of using me as an example. Most of these guys you're looking at are in their 20s. And this is not the Gerry Griffin show, but it's. I want to use me as an example. There's that picture again that you saw earlier. This was my first flight as a flight director. I'm 33 years old. I had been in the control center already 4 years. And so I'm 33 years old. I'm one of the oldest guys in the room. Here's the 5 flight directors that worked on Apollo 11. We had 4 shifts. We used 4 shifts quite often, but for Apollo 11, which was the first landing, we double manned the flight director console. That was me and Cliff Charlesworth, the guy that's, I'm going to put our ages up here. I was 34, Cliff was 37. We actually teamed up and had 2 flight directors on because we were responsible for the launch from Earth and the translunar injection, the burn that sent us onto the moon. And we were also responsible for the lunar surface activity, the extra EVA, we called it. Now, all of us except, well, 3 of us, me at 34, Gene at 35, Gene Kranz sitting down. He's the guy that wore the vest all the time. You'll see him later in some pictures. Milt Winter, we were all in the Air Force, and we had all flown. So we were probably 3 to 4 years older than the other people in the control center. Cliff had come up through the ranks, and so had Glenn. Glenn was the youngest at 32. Cliff Charlesworth at 37 was the oldest guy in the crowd. And again, here we are, and I'm age 34. This was on the Apollo 11. It just landed back on Earth. And we were celebrating when we brought out the flags. And I actually had that cigar in my mouth, and it was lit. It was burning. And I hated cigars. But anyway, it was the tradition. And but most of the people that you're looking at, particularly down there in the front of the room, were in their 20s. Very young crowd. Here I am on Apollo 12. I was the lead flight director. We're going to talk about this flight a little bit here in a second because it had a big problem, big issue. And I was 34 years old. Here's Kraft, who at this time sat at this console behind us, who was the director of flight operations. So he was my immediate boss. And I'm going to tell you a story about what we were saying in this picture here. But again, young guys. Here was Apollo 13 in 1970. There were 4 of us. Now we're starting to get a little older. You can see our hairstyles change a little bit as the age of Aquarius, and it was kind of a fun time. I put this one up because you couldn't see Milt's face. This was taken right after they landed on Earth, and we had gotten them back home safely. And I've got a picture of the 4 of us. I didn't put it in here. Taken 45 years later. We don't look quite the same. Kind of interesting. Here's Apollo 14. Getting a little older now. This was the 4th from the end. This is Glenn Lunny here. He was probably coming on to relieve me, and Kranz had probably come in for some reason. There you can see he's got on one of his vests. Now we're up to 15. Hair's getting a little longer, a little more relaxed, looking a little older. This is 15. I was the lead flight director for this flight, and this is where the 2 guys were out on the surface, Dave Scott and Jim Irwin, during one of their excursions. And they had 3 very long ones, so I don't know which one it was, but it was, and then Apollo 17 was the finale. Krantz is now 39, I'm 37. Neil Hutchinson was a young guy that we knew was going to be a shuttle flight director because we were all going to move on to something different. We were kind of worn out. And I asked Neil to sit with me to kind of get the feel for what it's like to be a flight director, and he did a great job. And it turned out he was the lead flight director for the first shuttle flight some years later. So the message I want to get you out of this is that we were really young. The guy that made one of the most critical calls I'm going to talk about in a second was 23 years old when he made it. He was from Oklahoma, small school, physics major, not an engineer. But anyway, we were really, and then we trained like crazy. We just simulated and simulated and simulated. And our simulation people could throw us trouble, could put problems in, and they could bring us to our knees. We would they would just bury us. And but we gained from that because when the flights were actually easier, except maybe for 13, the flights were easier than the sims. It was like running with combat boots on and then changing to running shoes. It was really much easier to do the real thing. But perhaps our greatest value was our leadership, who trusted all these young people to do it. And that leadership started at the very top. We had, when John F. Kennedy started this and he got assassinated, he was succeeded by Lyndon Johnson, who in this picture is over his right shoulder and on the left of the photo. Both of them were Democrats, Democrat Party. And when Johnson didn't run for re-election, Nixon won against the incumbent, or I've forgotten who he ran against, but he beat him. And so we had a change to the Republican Party. Throughout those three changes, or those two changes with three different people in two parties, the leadership at the White House never wavered. They stayed behind us. Now I'm going to tell you a personal story that shows you what the leadership did. On Apollo 12, I was the flight director for the launch. We got struck by lightning about 35 seconds after we lifted off. And some of you probably have heard that old term SCE to aux. I don't know, it's become kind of almost folklore over here. You see it on t-shirts. A young man, when we got hit by lightning, it knocked everything out of the spacecraft. All the power, the battery, the re-entry batteries was the only thing left powering. Lights got all dim. Most of the controls became inoperative. The Saturn continued to work, and it was guiding at that point, so we stayed with it. And a young man, who's the 23-year-old from Oklahoma I was telling you about, said, "Flight, ask him to try SCE to aux." I had never heard of the switch, signal conditioning equipment to auxiliary instead of normal, is what he was trying to tell me. So we fiddled around. It was kind of a comedy of errors. I said, "What?" And he said, SCE to aux. Now I turned to the Capcom, who was to speak to the crew, and said, "Tell him to try SCE to aux." And the Capcom said, "What?" Because we had never fiddled with that little obscure switch. Well, anyway, we finally got it up to the crew. And Pete Conrad was the commander. The first time he heard it, he said, "What the hell is that?" Well, it turns out that Alan Bean was the lunar module pilot. He knew where the switch was, and he took it from auxiliary to, or normal to auxiliary, and we got our data back in the control center. And we could see that he had, it's kind of like a power outage at your house when you get struck by lightning, knocks all things off, and then things have to get reset. We reset the fuel cells, which were providing power, and we got it back up and we went on. This whole time, the vehicle was climbing on the right trajectory, and I kept watching that to make sure we were getting where we should be, not going off course, where we would have had to abort. We didn't want to abort because it was very violent to abort one of these things while you're under powered flights. So we went on to orbit. Now we had a big decision to make. We'd been hit by lightning. We'd gotten everything back up. It appeared to be okay. But should we go to the moon or should we come home? Just deorbit and come home, not do the big burn to go to the moon. This picture is when Kraft came. This is the kind of leadership we had. He came down and told me, he said, Gerry, we don't have to go to the moon today, but it's your call all the way. He turned around, went back to his own console, which was a way of telling me that he trusted whatever our team came up with, he was going to be comfortable with and he would back it. That was the kind of leadership we had, where you had these young people making these life-determining decisions and being trusted to do it. That's changed today, and it's worrisome to a bit because today there's a lot of, as you know, second guessing. And I'll come back to that in a second. But it was a great example to me, and I didn't even think of it at the time. I thought it was a natural thing. I said, oh, okay, Chris, thanks. And but then I got to thinking about it in my later life. What a trust. And it was because we were capable and ready. Leadership story number 2, Apollo 13. We're on our way to the moon. Everything looks good. 200,000 miles from home. We're 40,000 miles to go to the moon. And we went to stir some cryogenic fluids that are super cold, like liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen. In zero G, they float around the tank and they kind of get some globules instead of being a homogeneous mixture. You have a fan in there that you turned on and it stirred it up and made it more homogeneous so it would feed out gaseous the way it was supposed to. But when we started to cryos, Big Bang, most of you have seen the movie, which I worked on. We can talk about if we have time. And we didn't know what it had done. This picture that you're looking at right now was taken right after they separated the surface module. They were almost back to Earth. And that's when Jim Lovell said the whole side of the spacecraft has been blown out. And so we didn't know it was that bad and we didn't get these pictures till they couldn't download them. So we didn't see this picture till they got on the ground. The film was developed, but it was a big explosion of an oxygen tank that killed all of our oxygen supply for the mothership, the command and service module. So turns out that Kranz's team was on duty when this happened. We took them offline. They went away and tried to figure out what to do. We got the crew into the lunar module. Thank goodness it was still with us. Had it not been with us, the mission would have been lost totally. The lunar module is what got us home. So we got them into the lunar module, and the 3 teams remaining, Lindler and Lonnie and my team, then went into 3.5 days of figuring out how to get them home. And it was a close call. The closest consumable we had was water. But we had to figure out how to get them home. We were going to slingshot around the moon, and then they were going to go off and land somewhere if we didn't do something in the Indian Ocean. So we figured out a way to do this maneuver after we went around the moon in a slingshot fashion where we could speed it up and get them home a day earlier and put them back in the Pacific where we had some recovery forces. That was called the PC plus 2, Paracynthian plus 2. PC, think of it in English, think of it point of closest approach to the moon, and 2 hours later. We used the descent engine on the lunar module to make that dock maneuver. And before we did it, we had some other options that were slower, and So Glenn Lunny and I went up to a viewing room on the other floor of the control center. Nobody there except the whole head of NASA, the head of the agency, the head of was a fellow named Tom Payne, Barnavon Brown was there, Chris Kraft was there, Deke Slayton, the head of the astronauts, was there. George Lowe, the program manager. We were looking at the leadership of NASA, these two young guys. And we briefed them on our options. And we said, when we got to the end, there were 4 options. And when we got to the end, we said the option we favor is the PC+2. And I remember thinking when we made that recommendation, we said, I remember thinking subconsciously, now we're going to find out, well, have you thought about this? And did you do that? Why aren't you going to do that? Which is much the way things get done today. And it didn't happen. In fact, there was total silence. And finally, the head of the agency, the head of NASA, a guy named Tom Payne, looked at us and he said, what can we do to help you? That's all he said. So again, the young guys that were trusted all the way up the line, we trusted them, they trusted us, we trusted the people below us. We said, we think we got it, sir. And we turned around, went back downstairs and went into the control center and did the PC+2 burn and got them home just fine. But again here, that's where you have leadership that doesn't try to do it for you. They enable you, empower you, hold you accountable. No doubt about that. But keep that in mind, all of you, as you go into your careers. There's the tendency today that when something goes wrong, we got to bring that decision up a level and let somebody of higher rank make it. And in Apollo, we shoved decisions down as low as we could to the people that really understood what was going on, and not trying to make it in Washington or somewhere else, but make it on the site where it happened. So there was a good lesson in there, and the leadership was I think, very much responsible for allowing the people to be prepared, get ready to go, and then just do it. So what happened after Apollo? I call this the hanging on period. We hung on for a while using some older hardware that didn't get used. We built Skylab. That's Skylab on the left there is the S2. That's an empty S2 stage off of Saturn. It was made into a laboratory. Then it was visited 3 times by crewmen, and it was very successful. On the right, Apollo-Soyuz was one mission. This was when we were trying to get friendly with the Soviet Union before the wall fell, and we docked up a command and service module with a Soyuz spacecraft, and they swapped, and they became very good friends. Alexei Leonov was the commander for the Soviets, and Tom Stafford for us. They became very good friends. I became very good friends with Leonov, and he's crazy. He's a crazy man. And then there was shuttle. 30 years of shuttle. And this is where spaceflight in many ways kind of came to its own, because this is when we finally did see a lot of nations fly, people from a lot of nations, a lot of women, people of color, all of that. The shuttle was really our coming out in terms of including everyone in the business. It flew 135 missions. We lost 2 of them, Challenger and Columbia, and both times 7 people were killed on each. And those were tragic losses that we learned a lot about, but a lot from them. But they were, of course, it's a risky business. There's no doubt. It's riskier than driving on the freeway, probably, maybe. I use the Hubble because the shuttle hauls so much cargo into space. But Hubble was a great example in what it could do. This thing is close to 60 feet long, and it was stowed in the payload bay and deployed with the arm. And with Canada, arm was made by Canada. And the thing that really impressive about this mission and the capability of the shuttle is they went up later and captured the Hubble, pulled it back into the cargo bay, and in that middle photo at the bottom, you can see astronauts out on the arm. They actually changed out equipment, upgraded it. They actually repaired the mirror. On the first visit, they had to put a contact lens over it because the lens was ground in Germany, and somehow there was a screw up in English or metric, and so it had a distortion. Had a distortion to it, so they went in and put a contact lens on it, and it worked just fine. After that, the Hubble has been very successful, and the shuttle carried up all kinds of satellites, communication satellites, defense satellites, all kinds of things. But I use the Hubble because it really kind of is an example. The shuttle hauled up most of the pieces of the space station, which looks like something like this today. Right there in the top center, there is a Soyuz dock there. But it all ended. In 2011, it ended. And then for the next almost 10 years, we flew with the Russians in the Soyuz, could carry 3 people. The U.S. paid $80 million per seat to get an astronaut to the space station. That's finally ended, hopefully. Although it could be, if the next slide I show you, start on the left, last May 30th, we launched the first time the SpaceX Falcon Dragon with 2 guys aboard, 2 astronauts. The picture on the lower left is the first stage that was recovered on a barge out in the Atlantic and brought back into port to be reused again. The middle pictures are, top one is the docking with the space station. And the middle picture, they're coming through the hatch, the 2 guys, and they joined the 3 guys that were already in the space station. And in that bottom picture, and then the pictures on the right are the recovery when they came down into the ocean and actually came down in the Gulf of Mexico and were hauled in, and it was very successful. Now, if all goes well, day after tomorrow, Saturday, the second SpaceX Falcon Dragon with a crew in it will be launched, and they'll have 4 astronauts in it to go to the space station. So, what's next? The first major goal is to go back to the moon and put the first woman and the next man, and that's the way they say it. It is possible that we'll make that by mid-decade this year. Second goal is to go on to Mars, and that's going to take a longer time. Who knows? But we're going to do it with Artemis. Artemis is the twin sister, by the way. That name is Apollo had a twin sister in Greek mythology, and Artemis was her name. And it's going to use the Space Launch System. These are all artist rendering. The SLS, the Space Launch System, hasn't flown yet, but the parts are coming together. It's about to. Uses some shuttle technology with solid rockets on the side of it. Saturn class lifts a lot. Orion, up at the top in the middle, there is the spacecraft. It's a Apollo Command Module on steroids. It's just bigger and more better. The Lunar Gateway is a station that they're going to put in lunar orbit to help them sustain time there. That might get axed. We may go back to the moon just the way we did before. And then the lunar lander, which is my last slide, or TBD, that's under the commercial sector is going to do that now. And there's 3 contracts out. One is Blue Origin, and this is their company rendition of what theirs might look like, a lander on the moon. Dynetics, a company in Huntsville, Alabama, is another. Their artist rendering of what they're going for. And then this is SpaceX again, just a plain old rocket-looking device, and that's what they're proposing, and they're actually building one of these things right now. I'm going to go through these very fast. There's just, in the meantime, a lot of commercial activity has gone on. We've got existing launch vehicles that have been in business for a long time. They grew out of the old intercontinental ballistic missile, but these have been launching satellites, payloads for all kinds of countries. You have, at ESA, you've got the Ariane set of rockets to do the same thing. New commercial rockets, I put the Falcon family in there by SpaceX. Northrop Grumman has designed one called Antares. Blue Origin, and they've flown. Blue Origin hasn't flown yet with New Glenn. But we have a mixture here. Cygnus on the lower left has flown. It's just a cargo hauler. It's flown on Antares. It's flown to the space station. The Dragon on the lower right has not only flown to the space station, now it's gone into orbit on. It's going to go into orbit on its own. It flew cargo to the space station first. The top two, the left one, the Starliner is a people hauler. It won't go beyond Earth orbit. And the one on the right, the Dream Chaser, is also a cargo hauler, and it won't go below Earth orbit. All of these are being built, and all are being scheduled to fly. So those are commercial spacecraft. So here's what I think is going to happen. Human spaceflight to low Earth orbit is going to be the domain of the current and new commercial companies. I think they're going to own getting to low Earth orbit. And I think human spaceflight is going to remain the primary domain of the governments. And I should have put an S on here. And it's going to be highly dependent on the stability of the international partners' funding, NASA's, and we got to have some stable funding if this is going to work. So that's it. We can take a question, or I can go through the movies real fast if you want me to. Give me a sign, Lucia. Should I go through the movies? You probably can't hear me. Maybe you can't talk. Let me do it real fast anyway. I first worked on Apollo 13. I was a technical advisor. Ron Howard contacted some of us and said, let's get together, and I want to see if I'm going to make a movie out of Apollo 13. And when we met him, he had Tom Hanks with him, and he had Kevin Bacon, and he had Bill Paxton, and they had a gazillion questions. And when they left, I thought they were not going to make a movie because they kept asking us. There were 6 of us that had worked on it. Said, were you scared? And we said, no, we weren't scared. We were trained, and we were ready to face it. And he said, you mean there was no emotion? And we looked at each other and said, no, we just got it done. But anyway, made a film out of it. I got about 30 days later, I got a call and said, you want to be a technical advisor on the movie? And I said, sure. And I didn't know what it meant. Well, it meant about 6 months out of my life and 6 months in Hollywood. And but it was a hoot. I learned a lot about movie making. And the funny thing about this movie is that every time we had a break, Tom Hanks wanted to talk about the real flight. And every time we had a break, I wanted to ask them, why are we breaking? Why are we stopping? Why don't we keep going here? And so I was trying to learn how they make a movie, and he was trying to learn what the real flight was like. That led to me working on Contact with Jodie Foster. Great movie, I think. And she was a delight to work with Matthew McConaughey. And I spent time with her alone before we started shooting, going through the script. And what a neat person, very, very capable. And this was the first fiction movie I had worked on, and that was different, but it was fun. And I got put in front of the camera on Contact. So I ended up getting paid as a technical advisor and as an actor. And so if you have a chance, buy those DVDs because I'm still getting residual payments. So anytime you can spend money on Contact or Deep Impact, the next one I got on camera, that was anytime you can buy those two, buy them because this was with Robert Duvall. Deep Impact was Robert Duvall, a real treat also. A lot different than Jodie Foster, but quite the actor. And it was about a comet that hits the Earth and so forth and so on. So you better pick that one up. Now that one I got in front of the camera, and so I just got to say one more time: buy those DVDs, buy it online, whatever you have to do. My last one was done in 2011, and this was different. Made in Canada, shot in Canada. It started out normal and then ends up paranormal, and it's far out, and it's different. I don't get any residuals on that one, so don't feel compelled. Anyway, that's it. Let's take some questions, and on any topics you want to talk about, and I will stop sharing